He built a global empire out of a single character, brandishing a massive hunting knife and a charming grin that captured the entire world's imagination. But behind the red carpets, the $300 million box office records, and the roaring laughter lies a private history of deep sacrifice, public scandal, and two women who loved him in ways he may never have truly deserved. And trust us, the truth about what happened behind closed doors is way more complicated than anyone imagined. At 86 years old, Paul Hogan has finally dropped the carefree Outback persona to make a stunning confession. He has finally admitted who the true love of his life was. But to understand the weight of that confession, we have to unearth the secrets of a past he tried so hard to rewrite and look closely at the staggering cost of finally saying it out loud. Long before the khakis, the crocodiles, and the international fame, Paul Hogan was just a young man from Parramatta in Western Sydney, a guy with calloused hands, empty pockets, and absolutely no grand plan for the future. In fact, he was so desperate to escape the monotony of his working-class reality that he constructed his very first illusion before he was even famous. Born on October 8, 1939, Hogan spent years telling journalists and fans that he hailed from Lightning Ridge, a rough-and-tumble opal mining town in the deep Outback. Why? Because the truth wasn't interesting enough. He wanted a backstory that matched the myth he was building. A dark secret of reinvention that started long before Hollywood came calling. The reality was far more grounded. He attended Parramatta Marist High School, left without a single academic distinction to his name, and immediately threw himself into hard labor. He found work as a rugged rigger hanging off the Sydney Harbour Bridge, risking his life daily high above the water, while moonlighting as a lifeguard at the local swimming pool in Granville just to make ends meet. And it was there, amidst the smell of chlorine and the scorching Australian sun in 1958, that his future finally introduced itself. Her name was Nolene Edwards. She was a striking 18-year-old. He was just 19. The courtship was stripped of any Hollywood romance. Paul later described the whole thing with the blunt simplicity of a man who didn't see the storm on the horizon. I was a massive flirt, and I liked her and she liked me, and we got married. That was it. No grand gestures, no elaborate dates. They were just two teenagers in Granville who were certain, the way teenagers always are, that love alone would be enough to survive. They tied the knot on June 24, 1958. Before Paul even turned 20, their first child arrived. By the time he was 22, they had 3 sons pulling at their pant legs. They scraped by on the meager wages from the bridge and the pool. Nolene single-handedly kept the chaotic household together, while Paul showed up for grueling shifts. They were, in the truest sense of the phrase, building an existence out of absolutely nothing. Then one fateful evening in 1971, Paul Hogan did something that would permanently alter the trajectory of Australian television history. He didn't just audition for showbiz, he hijacked it. Hogan walked onto the set of a popular talent program called New Faces, not because he had a burning desire to perform, but essentially as a high-stakes heckler with a calculated plan. He had watched the show from his couch and despised how the arrogant judges humiliated vulnerable contestants. So he decided to walk out onto that stage and humiliate the judges instead. Clomping onto the pristine studio set in his muddy work boots, Hogan cracked sharp jokes at the panel's expense, banged 2 rusty shovels together, and completely turned the power dynamic upside down. The network executives were horrified, but the audience went absolutely wild. He was invited back in and again because the public couldn't get enough of this anti-establishment hero. That single, chaotic stunt caught the attention of legendary producer Mike Willesee of A Current Affair, and just like that, a television titan was born. The Paul Hogan Show followed soon after, pumping out 60 wildly popular episodes between 1973 and 1984. The entire premise was built on a simple, intoxicating idea: the ordinary working man who refuses to be impressed by elites. But behind the scenes, that overnight glory brought a jarring, toxic reality. Hogan later admitted that transitioning from a bridge rigger to a television star was the hardest thing he ever did, harder than conquering Hollywood, harder than navigating international fame. It came with a profound psychological discomfort he never anticipated. "I was poor and famous," Hogan confessed, "and that was uncomfortable." While Paul was busy becoming a national treasure, a much darker, lonelier chapter was quietly unfolding at home. Nolene was left behind in the suburbs, raising 5 children, managing a sprawling household, and watching her husband mutate into a celebrity. She was forced to experience his fame from the inside out, where the glamour is completely invisible, and the only thing you actually feel is an empty, aching absence. By 1981, after 23 years of grinding marriage, the foundation finally cracked. They divorced for the first time. Hogan never dressed the split up with public relations spin. It was the classic, devastating story of the pressures of sudden fame, the yawning distance, and the way a life built on mutual survival hollows out when one person starts spending all their time on the other side of the world, being adored by millions of complete strangers. Yet, in a shocking twist that only made the eventual ending way worse than anyone imagined, they realized they couldn't stay apart. They discovered that nearly 3 decades of shared blood, sweat, and history cannot simply be filed away in a lawyer's cabinet. In 1982, less than a year after their bitter split, Paul and Nolene remarried. For a brief moment, the public rejoiced. It seemed the working-class sweethearts had beaten the odds. But that fragile peace was about to be utterly shattered. In 1985, Paul Hogan staked his entire life, his reputation, and every cent he had on a script he had co-written about a bushman navigating the concrete jungle of New York. He headed into the brutal, isolated Australian outback to film Crocodile Dundee, and it was on that dusty, high-tension set that Nolene's worst nightmares materialized in the form of a 26-year-old American actress. Linda Kozlowski was everything the suburban, grounded Nolene was not. Born in Fairfield, Connecticut, Linda was a fiercely talented, Juilliard-trained actress who had paid her dues on the gritty stages of Broadway. She arrived at the auditions with a glowing recommendation from Hollywood royalty Dustin Hoffman, who had worked with her on Death of a Salesman. When Linda landed the role of Sue Charlton, she was thrust into conditions that were primitive, dangerous, and wildly intense. Her filming hut sat literally on the edge of a murky, crocodile-infested swamp. These weren't movie props, they were real. Aggressive predators protected by law that would crawl up onto the land at night, surrounding her quarters. During aquatic scenes, the crew actually had to station a man armed with a loaded Magnum revolver between Linda and the water's edge just to keep her alive. The sheer terror and isolation of the shoot acted like a pressure cooker. Between the long, sweaty days in the bush and the adrenaline of surviving the elements, an undeniable, magnetic chemistry ignited between the rugged Australian comic and the sophisticated American starlet. When Crocodile Dundee hit theaters, it didn't just succeed, it exploded, pulling in an astronomical $328 million globally. But as Paul Hogan ascended to the absolute peak of Hollywood royalty, his personal life collapsed into one of the ugliest, most venomous public legal battles in Australian history. The affair between Paul and Linda was exposed, and by 1989, the second marriage to Nolene didn't just end, it disintegrated in a nuclear blast of litigation. The details of their second divorce shocked the nation. It was a brutal multi-million-dollar war over an empire they had built together from nothing. The media tore into the carcass of their relationship, painting Paul as the unfaithful traitor who abandoned his loyal wife for a younger, glamorous Hollywood star. When the dust finally settled in 1990, Nolene walked away with a reported $40 million settlement, a staggering, record-breaking sum at the time, but the emotional scars left an indelible mark on the Hogan family dynasty. Just months after the ink dried on the divorce papers, Paul and Linda were married in a lavish, heavily publicized ceremony. For years, they lived the high life in Los Angeles, welcoming a son named Chance. To the world, it looked like Paul had successfully traded in his old life for a flawless, sun-drenched American dream. But Hollywood endings are rarely real. In 2014, after 23 years of marriage, the exact same amount of time he had spent with Nolene during their first run, Linda Kozlowski filed divorce. She cited irreconcilable differences, later admitting that she had grown tired of living in Paul's massive shadow, stating simply that they had naturally grown apart and shared no common interests anymore. Now, sitting in his expansive home at 86 years old, physically frail and looking back at the wreckage and riches of an extraordinary life, Paul Hogan is finally coming clean. He recently let slip the ultimate confession, admitting that he had finally realized who the true love of his life was. But in classic, enigmatic Hogan fashion, the revelation carries a sting of tragic irony. Was it Nolene, the woman who endured the dirt, the poverty, and the grueling labor of his youth, only to be cast aside when the spotlights grew too bright? Or was it Linda, the glamorous co-star who matched his Hollywood ambition, but ultimately walked away when the illusion faded? The tragedy of Paul Hogan's empire is that by trying to have it all, the fame, the fortune, and the fantasy, he ensured that the answer to that question would come far too late to save either relationship. He conquered the world with a smile and a knife, but in the end, the sharpest cut of all was the one he delivered to his own heart. She never complained once. Despite the mud, the isolation, and the terrifying reality of their surroundings, Linda Kozlowski stood her ground. As Paul Hogan later told People magazine, the crew was convinced the transition would break her. We thought the bugs and the snakes and the danger of crocodiles would freak her right out. There have been 3 or 4 deaths up there from crocodiles since Christmas, but she never complained. Hogan, possessing the blunt directness that had always been his defining quality, didn't mince words about her talent either. Before Dundee, she was unemployed and broke, but she delivered the goods, he admitted. She was a star in waiting. But it wasn't just her acting that was turning heads on set. The film's director, Peter Feynman, watched the electrifying chemistry developing between his 2 leads with the eye of someone who had a high-stakes job to do. He could see, in real time, that something stretching far beyond a professional relationship was unfolding in the wilderness. As the grueling shoot went on, Feynman noted that they simply understood each other better and better and better. Paul's close friend, Delvine Delaney, was more direct still, unearthing the immense guilt and anxiety underlying the romance. Linda actually came to her at one point, deeply worried about the moral cost of what was happening. She knew Paul was married. She knew he had 5 children waiting back home. But according to those on set, the attraction was an absolute freight train. It was completely unstoppable. Despite the professional stumbles, the media chronicled their every move with an suffocating intensity. A notorious 1988 report in the Sydney Morning Herald meticulously documented a transatlantic flight to London. A fellow first-class passenger leaked that Paul and Linda hardly left each other alone through the whole flight. In those peak years, their romance was exactly what the public wanted it to be: electric, unapologetic, and completely real. But what the world saw on the glossy magazine covers was not the reality festering inside the marriage. Linda had walked into the relationship harboring immense artistic ambitions that a ruthless Hollywood machine would never allow her to fulfill on her own terms. Following the astronomical success of the first Dundee, she found herself trapped in a gilded cage, constantly offered roles she found deeply demeaning. After Crocodile Dundee, I turned down lots of stuff, Linda later revealed. Most of it was where I'd play the girlfriend of some funny man. Desperate to carve out her own identity, she pivoted to a series of grueling, direct-to-video films throughout the 1990s movies with titles that history has completely erased. The experience wasn't just unfulfilling, it was physically toxic. These straight-to-video schlocky films were giving me an ulcer, she confessed bluntly, basically because I was the only one on the set that cared about anything. Eventually, the spirit broke. She walked away from acting entirely, realizing the dream had died. I thought, this isn't fun anymore. This is not why I studied. It's not what I love. For a brief window, the sacrifice seemed manageable. Their son, Chance, was born in 1998, offering a temporary sanctuary from her fading career. I'm 43 years old. I've got a baby. I'm happy and content, she told the Scripps Howard News Service in 2001. But contentment, built on the total sacrifice of one's identity, always has a strict shelf life. Behind closed doors, Paul remained deeply traditional in ways that Linda's modern American ambitions simply could not accommodate. He craved stability, a quiet, home-centered life, and a traditional wife who prioritized the household above all else. Linda had given him exactly that, but in doing so, she realized she had erased herself. Friends close to the actress whispered that she felt completely imprisoned, that she had stopped existing as an independent individual and had mutated into nothing more than Mrs. Hogan. The breaking point arrived in October 2013. Linda officially filed for divorce in the Los Angeles Superior Court, citing irreconcilable differences. That sterile legal phrase that seamlessly covers 1,000 specific bleeding emotional wounds without naming a single one. Their son Chance was just 15. The final settlement was swift and clinical. Linda was granted a one-off payment of $6, $25 million, and the right to remain in their luxurious Los Angeles mansion for 4 years, or until she remarried. Paul, crucially, kept the exclusive rights to the Crocodile Dundee character. The iconic role that had brought them together stayed with him while the woman walked right out the door. Linda didn't hide her relief when talking to New Idea. I lived in Paul's shadow for many, many years, and it's nice to feel my own light right now. Paul, utilizing the self-aware deflection that had always served as his psychological armor against pain, minimized the split to the Daily Telegraph. I'm very flighty. A woman lasts for about a quarter of a century, and then they get bored with me. We were opposites in everything, from the food we ate, the music we liked, the entertainment we liked, the colors, the clothes, the places, everything. It worked anyway. On the surface, both camps frantically released public statements painting the split as completely amicable. But beneath the carefully managed calm of the PR machines, a far more jarring picture began to form. Linda immediately fled the constraints of her old life, traveling to the vibrant landscapes of Morocco. It was there that she met a local tour guide named Moulay Hafid Baba. She described an instantaneous, almost otherworldly connection with him, stating it felt as though they had already known each other for 1,000 years. They were officially married in 2017. When the shocking news of Linda's sudden Moroccan marriage reached Los Angeles, Paul's manager quickly scrambled to issue a statement, insisting the star was genuinely delighted and that any rumors of heartbreak were pure, fabricated invention. But an insider leaking details to New Idea painted a radically different, utterly devastating picture of what was actually happening inside his mansion. Paul is devastated that Linda has sold her home and cut ties with America. He's going to be incredibly lonely now that they are moving to Morocco. Paul doesn't have a lot of friends in LA and finds it hard to get close to new people, so it's affecting him a lot. Yet, in a bizarre twist of fate, Linda still refused to entirely let him go. She reportedly remained deeply anxious about his deteriorating health, specifically his heavy, lifelong smoking habit. A close friend revealed to Woman's Day that Linda was constantly badgering him to have regular health checkups and to give up the cigarettes because she wants him around for a long while yet. It is a deeply strange, melancholic kind of tenderness the woman who had to escape his shadow just to survive, still watching from a safe distance across the globe to make sure he doesn't entirely disappear into the dark. The twilight of Paul Hogan's life has brought brutal, agonizing challenges that no amount of box office royalty could ever soften. In 2003, his world was turned upside down when the Australian Taxation Office launched a ferocious, highly publicized investigation into allegations that he had covertly funneled millions in film profits into hidden offshore accounts. The grueling multi-agency probe, codenamed Operation Wickenby, dragged on for 7 agonizing years, systematically dismantling his reputation as the carefree, honest Aussie bloke. The trap finally snapped shut in 2010. When Paul flew back to Australia to attend his own mother's funeral, he was blindsided at the airport with a draconian departure prohibition order. He was effectively trapped, barred from leaving his own home country until an alleged tax debt of $37.5 million Australian dollars was entirely resolved. While criminal charges were eventually dropped and a highly confidential settlement was reached, in 2012, the endless legal warfare shattered his spirit. By the time he entered his 80s, the physical toll became entirely impossible to hide. Severe muscle atrophy and relentless chronic pain rapidly eroded the rugged mythic physical presence that had once captivated the globe. His rare, fleeting public appearances shocked onlookers, revealing a man visibly diminished, frail, and a far cry from the robust Mick Dundee audiences remembered. He has spoken about the decay without open complaint because self-pity was never his style. But in the quietest hours of his isolation, the words he has let slip carry a crushing, definitive weight. I once had it all: fame, fortune, and a wonderful wife. But in the end, I still feel like I lost something most important. Then, in December 2024, something happened that was bittersweet enough to feel scripted. What do you think was the turning point that truly sealed Paul Hogan's isolation? Was it the loss of his Hollywood fantasy with Linda, or the realization of what he had thrown away with Nolene decades prior? It was the reunion the world thought it would never see. For the first time since their explosive, high-stakes divorce, Paul Hogan and Linda Kozlowski reunited publicly in a moment that sent shockwaves through the entertainment world. The occasion? A celebration of Crocodile Dundee. The Encore cut a digitally restored 4K version of the cinematic masterpiece that made them global icons, complete with an exclusive tell-all documentary. Standing before a wall of flashing cameras, the contrast was heartbreaking. At 85 years old and visibly frail, Paul stood beside Linda once again. Together, they watched the restored footage of themselves from 1986. They were young, they were electric, they were utterly unstoppable. Yet, as the old footage rolled, Paul kept the true depth of his emotions hidden behind that trademark, rugged grin. Trying to deflect the heavy tension in the room, he cracked a joke, claiming the 4K restoration made even him look better. The audience laughed. Of course they did, because that is exactly what Paul Hogan has always done when the absolute truth would cost him too much. And trust us, the truth about what happened behind the scenes of his legendary life is way more complicated than anyone ever imagined. To understand the sheer magnitude of Paul Hogan's rise, you have to realize that his career wasn't just successful, it was one of the most uniquely explosive phenomena in box office history. He didn't just break Hollywood, he conquered it. But behind the scenes, another chapter of his life was quietly unfolding, filled with surreal moments where the world's biggest icons bowed to his charm. Take, for instance, a legendary dinner party with Elizabeth Taylor. From 2 tables away, the ultimate Hollywood tough guy, Clint Eastwood, leaned over, picked up his table knife, and simply held it up in silent tribute. Paul understood the unspoken gesture immediately. Eastwood looked right at him and said, "Sir, you're right." Then came the royal treatment. At the massive premiere of Crocodile Dundee 2, Paul found himself sitting directly between Prince Charles and Princess Diana. He could feel the royals literally nudging his elbow every time a joke made them laugh. In that moment, Paul remembers thinking to himself, "Don't they know I'm just a rigger from Parramatta?" Those are the golden, larger-than-life memories Paul Hogan can share without it costing him a thing. But the other chapters of his life, they cost him everything. However, that global glory didn't last forever. Fast forward to May 2026, and the glitz of Hollywood was replaced by the flashing blue lights of a real-life family crisis. In a shocking turn of events, police were called to Paul's Venice Beach home. His 27-year-old son, Chance, who had been living with his father, was taken into custody for domestic battery. At 86 years old, a frail Paul Hogan was forced to stand outside his front door, speaking with officers while his son was tracked down and arrested just a few blocks away. This wasn't just a legal dispute, it was a devastating public unearthing of deep family fractures. Today, at 86, Paul Hogan sits alone in that massive house in Venice Beach, a place where a thriving family was supposed to be. The silence inside those walls is deafening when compared to the vibrant lives his former flames are living across the globe. Nolene Edwards, the woman who gave Paul his best years and survived the wreckage of their legendary bitter divorce, has built a beautiful life entirely on her own. She is completely at peace in Sydney, sharing glimpses of her happiness and quiet Italian coastlines with her own followers. Meanwhile, Linda is living a life of exotic romance in Marrakesh, spending nights in the Sahara Desert with a man who makes her laugh, building a legacy that belongs entirely to her. And Paul? He is left walking completely alone on the very same beach where he and Linda used to stroll hand in hand. He remains in the city where he came to conquer his dreams, staying long after his reasons for being there have all moved on. Before the cameras, Paul once admitted that Linda was the love of his life. He probably meant it at the time, but those who have closely followed his epic journey know the dark secret he may never fully let himself admit. Nolene Edwards was also the love of his life. It was a different kind of love, quieter, deeper, and forged in the fires of obscurity, long before he ever became a household name. It's the kind of love that remains steady after the box office records are broken, the money is spent, and the Hollywood spotlight has completely faded into the dark. If this behind-the-scenes look into the bittersweet reality of a Hollywood legend stayed with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on those notifications so you never miss an exclusive scoop. Leave us a comment below. What do you remember most about the magic of Crocodile Dundee? And what do you really think about the heartbreaking road Paul Hogan has traveled since? We want to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.